Hello and welcome back to the East Anglia Hobbit Community Podcast. This on the lore focus series. We're back, CJ, the host, with the Tolkien Nerd resident, James Wilson. Say hello, James.
Hello, James.
So this week is Dwarves. First up, we're going to set a fire going. We're going to pull up the armchair, get a glass of scotch, and some second breakfast, as James describes to us how the Dwarves came into being.
Yes, if you're just joining this little podcast series, we've done 2 episodes previously. In the first episode, we kind of looked at the profiles in Gondor at war, so the likes of Ingold and Hurin, and kind of how those characters translate from the books to the games. And then in the second episode, we looked at the lore of the elves, so they're the firstborn, so the lore of the elves and how they came into being. And so now we move on to the noble sons of Durin, the Dwarves. The interesting story about the dwarf background is these guys were actually the first beings alive on Middle-earth, and they were created in secret by one of the Valar until Ilúvatar essentially discovered the dwarves and said, no, you don't have the right to create life, so you're going to have to destroy the dwarves. So kind of like the classic, oh, you've got to destroy your creation. But then, of course, Ilúvatar takes pity and says, okay, the dwarves deserve to live, but I want the elves to be the firstborn children of Middle-earth. And so essentially what happens is the dwarves are placed in an enchanted sleep, and they're left sleeping underground for the many, many years once the whole business with the elves going to Valinor and the whole mess with Morgoth and the Silmarils takes place. So the idea is when the elves are returning to Middle-earth to fight the war to reclaim the Silmarils, the dwarves start to wake up. So like these are the elves dwarves in Middle-earth, and kind of they wake up and go wandering, and they go off and found like the great dwarven kingdoms. So kingdoms like Moria is founded in the very early years of Middle-earth, and Durin the First is one of the oldest dwarves, is kind of like one of the oldest dwarves alive, and kind of that's kind of like a little introduction to the arrival of the dwarves. And as the wars go on, the dwarves kind of prove themselves to be very hardy, grim folk, and become sort of like masters at forging armor and weapons. And they kind of say that like the dwarves are more resistant to fire, mostly because it's the armor they grant themselves, and they kind of become like the craftsmen. But again, the elves and the dwarves, they initially get along well enough, and then in kind of like the later years, once the Silmaril's been recovered, that's when the whole issue between the war of the dwarves and elves starts. Because the basic background is the Silmaril gets recovered, and so the elves basically go to the dwarves and say, okay, we've stolen the Silmaril, here's a massive necklace that we want you to stick the Silmaril in. And the dwarves go off and do that, and then they say, all right, we've done the work, now pay us. And the elf king Thingol basically says, no, I'm not going to pay you. Look at all this might and power I've got. I can easily destroy you. And so the dwarves kill him. So, yeah, that's kind of where the whole problem starts. Those dwarves then try to flee with the Silmaril. They're caught and killed by the elves. The survivors then go back to their dwarf kingdom. Then those dwarves invade in Thingol's kingdom and basically ransack it, and again try to steal the Silmaril. But then they try to flee, and then they're caught and captured by a load of elves, and that's our very first introduction to the Ents as well, because as the dwarves are trying to flee, the survivors run into the Ents, who utterly destroy them. So kind of the 2 main dwarf kingdoms that appear in the Silmaril. And again, that's kind of where I'm getting all the source material for this. Is all found in the Silmaril, but in the Silmarillion, I should say. Mm-hmm. And then kind of you go into the latter years, and the dwarves kind of, they're not really prominent in kind of like the Second Age and the War of the Last Alliance. There is references to them. Say, for example, when Sauron is waging his war against the elves and it all looks hopeless, what the story tells obviously the Númenóreans arrive, but what also happens is a dwarf force coming out of Moria assails the orcs from the rear, and kind of that massive orc army is destroyed. And so then you have the War of the Last Alliance, which is prominently elves and men, although dwarves do play their parts. Again, there's not a lot of real references. You don't really know if elves and dwarves fight alongside elves and men in the great big battle of the Dagarath and the the fall of Sauron. It's entirely possible, and it would fit in with the relevant time periods, but there's not really enough written. And so kind of the dwarves go back to the mines of Moria, and obviously then that's when the trouble starts, and they awaken the Balrog, which essentially lays waste to their kingdom, drives the dwarves out of Moria, and so they become essentially a wandering folk, and they kind of establish themselves in places like the Iron Hills, and then they establish themselves in the Blue Mountains, which on a map of Middle-earth, the Blue Mountains are kind of northwest of the Shire, so kind of like the northernmost range of mountains in Middle-earth. And then, of course, you've got the Grey Mountains, you've got the Iron Hills as well, and of course the most famous of mountains, actually no, probably the second famous mountain in Middle-earth, because obviously you've got Mount Doom, but then of course you have the Lonely Mountain, and this is the kingdom of Erebor. And the way that starts, again, this is all covered in The Hobbit, but essentially the dwarves are driven out of the northern mountains by, I think it's dragons and drakes, and they essentially find their way south, make their way to Erebor, and that is kind of where they establish their last great kingdom. And so it's kind of, by the time of the War of the Ring, Erebor is really the last dwarf kingdom standing, because kind of Moria is now deserted and overrun by orcs, and the dwarves that live in the Blue Mountains are kind of they're a scattered people. They don't really have the numbers to march to war. So yeah, so again, you've got obviously the famous dwarves that appear in Tolkien's writings. You've got Gimli, obviously. You've got then Thorin and his company. And so, yeah, that's kind of like your basic history covering the dwarves of Middle-earth. And obviously you can read more in The Hobbit, which goes into a little bit of background of the dwarves, and then kind of some more stories are told in the Silmarillion. But that's the basic background of the origination of the dwarves in Middle-earth.
Righto. So at what point do the dwarf rings come into the equation?
So the dwarven rings are forged at the same time as the 3 rings for the elves and the 9 rings for mortal men. And they're essentially, the 9 rings that are made for men, and the 7 dwarf rings were forged with the aid of Sauron. The 3 rings were not forged by him, and so they're kind of given to the greatest of the dwarves. And we know that Thrain and Thror, so Thorin's father and grandfather, they both wore one of the dwarven rings, but Thrain's dwarven ring is basically taken by Sauron when he's basically captured in the dungeons of Dol Guldur. It's taken from him. As for the other 6 dwarven rings, we don't really know what's happened to them. We do learn in the Fellowship that several of them have been consumed by, I think it's 3 have been consumed by dragons, and then the other 4 are held by Sauron. So it's kind of, we don't really understand the power of the dwarven rings. We don't quite understand what it is they do. Because, for example, the 9 rings that were made for men, we all know that they were essentially taken over by Sauron. They became the ring wraiths. We know what happens to the elven rings, but as for the dwarven rings, it's not something that's really covered in the writings. Like I said, we know Thrain has his ring, and it's taken by Sauron, so we can assume that Sauron has at least one of the dwarven rings, but we don't know if that gets recovered by the end of the story. It could have been lost in the destruction of Mordor. We honestly don't know. I mean, when the ringwraiths are trying to persuade Dane and the dwarves to give up Bilbo, they are offered one of the dwarven rings as a reward. So it's entirely possible that is the same ring that was taken from Thrain. But again, we just don't know. So that's kind of... It's interesting, I think, that the Dwarven rings are the ones that are the least covered in the lore of Middle-earth. So it's kind of... It's open for interpretation. We don't quite know what the powers are of the Dwarven rings. We know what the powers of the Elven rings are, because you've got the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Water, the Ring of Air. We know about the One Ring. We don't really know much about the 9 rings, other than they basically used to ensnare the Ringwraiths under Sauron's sway. But
so was that the idea with the dwarf ones, to try and corrupt the Dwarven kings?
It is entirely possible. I mean, a dwarf Ringwraith would be a very, very interesting concept, but I think the dwarves, I think, probably were less prone to falling under Sauron's sway than the Ringwraiths. I think what you kind of learn from the stories of Middle-earth is men are a lot easier to manipulate than elves and dwarves. There's not many dwarves who turn against each other. So that's kind of the interesting fact there. I think it was maybe more meant to highlight sort of like men's weakness.
Well, I have read, though I don't know if this is fan fiction, that the dwarvish lust for gems and gold and wealth is derived from the Rings of Power, or the Dwarven rings, which is partly why Thrain or Thror was susceptible to the dragon sickness, because he was wearing a Dwarven ring. And therefore he thinks, oh, I must have lots of treasure, and go slowly mad with it.
It's entirely possible, but it's not something I've come across. I mean, there's absolutely nothing to say it's not true, but it kind of makes sense, considering as well it's kind of like it's the dwarves' desire for mining and to mine mithril and all the precious gems that causes them to awaken the Balrog. So it could be that the Dwarven rings are a result of that. I mean, it's entirely possible that Durin possessed one of the Dwarven rings, and it could have been lost when the kingdom fell to the Balrog. So it could be that there's one was recovered from Moria. We don't know. It's there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of open story on these. So there's absolutely nothing to say that it's not true.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because in the profiles, Durin has the Ring of Durin, and so does Thror, which would imply somehow Thror got hold of this. And I was wondering if that's something to do with Durin is killed in Moria, and then Thror's has a major battle outside of Moria. But then I would have thought, wouldn't the Balrog have the ring, or does the Balrog not care about the ring? Does he just drop it?
In theory, I don't think the Balrog itself wouldn't be concerned with stealing trinkets like that. But the orcs, quite possibly, it could be they recover the ring and it's passed on to Sauron's forces. That's entirely possible. But again, we don't necessarily know that the two. It's more than likely they're two different rings, because yes, the dwarves do defeat the orcs and kind of they do reclaim Moria, but no one ventures into Moria. And I think there's a little bit more on that we cover in the Q&A session in a little bit. But
okay.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that those are two different rings. We don't quite know how Thror came into being in possession of the ring either. So it's kind of again, it's one of those just open areas.
We'll stick with the Balrog theme. Are dwarves just unlucky? What was a Balrog doing underground in the mountain anyway? Because I don't know much about their backstory, apart from they were almost like the First Age wars were so kind of grand scale that Balrogs were almost like foot soldiers. And so is this the only Balrog left in Middle-earth? Are they just unlucky that he was snoozing under a mountain?
He's believed to be the last of the Balrogs. So essentially, in the First Age of Middle-earth, the Balrogs were Maiar. So they're spirits of fire that were essentially corrupted by Morgoth's powers. And yeah, they essentially did become like commanders of his legions of orcs. They were in like the tales of the Silmarillion, there are dozens of Balrogs at one point, and they're over the course of the many wars, they are slain. I think sort of like Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, is killed during the battle of the fall of Gondolin, and then obviously Glorfindel achieves his great feat of slaying a Balrog as well, and then kind of by the end of the First Age, when it's the War of Wrath, which is essentially the men and elves go to the Valar and essentially say Morgoth's become too powerful, he's taking over Middle-earth, and kind of like the Valar assemble this great big host and they just wage war on Morgoth and his forces, ultimately defeat them, destroy his stronghold, and he's cast out beyond the world. But in that time, in the course of that war, a lot of Balrogs are probably destroyed, and then they talk about others kind of flee into like deep, dark depths. So it's entirely possible there are more Balrogs hiding, but that particular Balrog just happened to be just sleeping under Khazad-dûm, and unfortunately it gets woken by the dwarves. So they kind of, as Saruman says, they delved too greedily and too deep.
But that's kind of what dwarves do. It's just kind of unfortunate that they dug in the wrong place.
Yes. So the backstory is the Balrog was awakened in some like the deepest of the mines of Moria. So obviously the dwarves had no idea that it was there, and I think there is a very, very strong argument. So kind of like their greatest kingdom, they wake up a Balrog, and it causes them to flee the whole kingdom. And then obviously they establish another enormous great kingdom at Erebor, and it's beset by a dragon. So, the dwarves were kind of
not lucky. Yeah.
No. Although, again, this is where you can sort of say it's open to interpretation, because obviously the dwarves fought against the elves and killed many, many elves in kind of like the sacking of that elf kingdom when they tried to steal the Silmaril. So you could argue that it's karmic balance, but then sort of like tragedy befalls the elves as well, because obviously they've committed kinslaying, and obviously elves are kind of a disappearing race by the time we get to the War of the Rings. So it's interesting that the two most prominent factions in the early writings, kind of like the elves and to a lesser extent the dwarves, by the time we get to the Fourth Age and the end of the War of the Ring, those two races are becoming less prominent, and it's more men taking over. So it's interesting to see the way the way things play out. But I think the dwarves can be said they are unlucky. But
I'm going to come back to dwarves with Silmarils in a second, but we're going to carry on with this idea of diminishing populations of dwarves, because obviously wars will take their toll. But this is another thing that I've picked up somewhere, but I'm not sure if it's Tolkien lore, in that only about a quarter of male dwarves actually settle down and marry, have a family, and the gender ratio of dwarves is roughly that as well. So basically, by any kind of population economics, that race is, going to vanish with a shrinking gene pool within a couple. I mean, I know dwarves live how long? Was it a couple of 100 years? But even so, you're talking a handful of generations. Dwarves are quite long-lived. I think at the time of the War of the Ring, and obviously when Dane falls in the Battle of Dale, he's 250 years old. So dwarves are fairly long-lived. I think Thorin was about 200 something when he's killed in the Battle of the Five Armies. Spoilers. But dwarves are fairly long-lived. I think Durin the First was known to the dwarves as the Deathless because he lived so long. But the whole the percentage of what's a female dwarf and what's a how dwarves marry, it's not something I've come across. But obviously, dwarves do decline, and then obviously there's that little story where Gimli's talking in the Two Towers where he says you don't see many dwarf women around, and it's kind of, again, dwarf women are not something that Tolkien goes into in any great detail. In fact, there's only one
female dwarf that's named in the entirety of his Middle-earth writings, and that is Dis,
It's
who
Thorin's
is
sister, isn't it?
Thorin's sister and the mother of Fili and Kili. So she's literally the only named female dwarf in the whole series. I mean, you do see some dwarf women at the start of the Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. If you look at the Dale scenes, and obviously when the dwarves are fleeing Erebor, there are some female dwarves, but then it's not really covered that much.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Tolkien doesn't cover a lot of women in general. There's only sort of 3 named female characters in the whole saga. Right, the Silmaril, because I've heard this suggestion that the Arkenstone is a Silmaril, or is it just the shiniest CGI prop they could get their hands on?
Yeah, no, I've heard this rumor too. But I can officially say the Arkenstone is not a Silmaril. Essentially, at the end of the War of the Jewels, there are 3 Silmarils. They are recovered. One is taken by Eärendil, the mariner, and he's set in the star. It's in the sky as a star. So one of the Eärendil, the brightest star in Middle Earth, is actually one of the Silmarils. And at the end of the Silmarillion, the 2 remaining Silmarils are stolen by the last remaining sons of Fëanor. But obviously the jewels are absolute purity, and they actually burn the hands of the sons of Fëanor. So one of them throws his into the sea, and the other one casts himself with it into a fiery chasm in the earth. So the Silmarils are essentially in the air, in the water, and in the earth. But yeah, no, the Arkenstone is not a Silmaril. I can understand why people would get that idea, but no, the Arkenstone itself is just a unique gem found at the heart of the Lonely Mountain. But yeah, it's not a Silmaril.
So, moving on to named weapons for the SBG game. Now, there are a couple scattered around. Durin's axe is wielded by Durin and then Balin. You've got Torazul, which is a giant troll-killing spear wielded by Mardin. And you have the Horn of Zirak-Zigil, which, as far all I know about Zirak-Zigil, is that's the peak where the Balrog is slain by Gandalf.
Yes.
So, what basis in lore do these named bits and pieces have?
There is a reference to Durin's axe in The Fellowship of the Ring. When Gandalf's reading the book, they do refer that they found Durin's axe. Whether it had a name, that's not stated, but yeah, Durin's axe definitely does exist. Torazol, the spear wielded by Mardin, is completely made up. There's no reference to the only famous spear in the Middle-earth writings is Aegilos, which is Gil-galad's spear. And then the references to like the Horn of Zirak-Zigil and things like that are also fictitious. They've probably been invented for the game, and they fit in quite nicely with the theme. But these are completely invented weapons. I mean, dwarves are sort of very, very prominent weaponsmiths in the story of Lord of the Rings. For example, Narsil is a dwarven forged sword. It's forged in the very first age of Middle-earth. We don't quite know how it came into Elendil's possession. It is entirely possible that it was given to Elros as a gift, and it kind of made its way through the entire generations of the kings of Númenor and its people, before eventually working its way to Elendil, and then technically Isildur, then all the way down to Aragorn, where it's then reforged into Andúril. So yeah, Narsil has kind of got it's got a very prominent history in Middle-earth. But yeah, quite a lot of the various swords that are referred to in the Middle-earth strategy battle game are not. They don't exist in Tolkien's lore, apart from the obvious ones. So things like Glamdring, Orcrists, which we know are from the story. Arwen's sword, Hadhadafang, is completely fictitious. That one doesn't exist in the Middle-earth series.
Oh.
And so, so Anduril, Orcrist, Glamdring, those are the only ones that are kind of referred to. And then, of course, you've got Eomer's sword, Guthwin, and Theoden's sword, Hergrim. But then, so there's only about 4 or 5, maybe half a dozen named weapons, because I've just remembered Sting as well. But those are the only named weapons in the game that are actually taken from Middle-earth writings itself. The others are completely made up.
Murin's got Kalazal as well, which take it that would be made up as well. So let's go with the Torazal and the Murin. So you've got Murin and Dra, you've got Mardin in the Khazad-dûm list, and Floy Stonehand. So I always put a question for the Q&A about, are these taken from any particular character in Tolkien's writings? And the thought occurred to me, Floy potentially, with the scribe in the book, is he supposed to be the scrawny one with the slingshot, the one that dies next to Balin's tomb?
No, because that is Ori.
So did they conflate the characters, or is Floy something altogether different?
There is a reference to Floy in the Fellowship of the Ring. When they're reading the Book of Mazarbul, there's a reference to a dwarf called Floy who is killed by an arrow when Balin's expedition makes its first arrival at the gates of Moria. It says, Floy was killed by an arrow, he slew the great, which suggests he must have slain a massive goblin captain, chieftain, king, where is it? It could have been something bigger, we don't know, but it's kind of just that's the only reference to any dwarf called Floy. So I think what they've done for the Middle-earth strategy battle game, they've taken the named dwarf and they've essentially expanded the profile. And that's why Floy is the lore master. He's been put into the Balin's expedition list, which kind of again, they've tried to tailor the name to fit the army list, which is quite nice. So they kind of use an existing name and try and build a profile around it, which is quite a nice way of incorporating the story and think, okay, that's all we've got, so how would he fit into that story? But the interesting thing is, Floy in the profile, he's not necessarily a fighter. He can hold his own, but he's more designed to neutralize enemy armies, because especially with his special rules that he can neutralize enemy special rules, that's quite handy. And you used to see Floy would be taken quite a lot in the game, sort of like on his own. But now the special rule is you can only take Floy if you take Balin. You can't take any other named heroes if you're running the Balin's expedition list, which is kind of, again, we covered this a little bit in kind of like in the FAQ podcast we did a few months back, and then kind of we don't want to go too far off topic, but kind of the basis I think behind it was you saw a lot less people taking themed armies because they would get trounced by people who would take a very, very competitive army that had nothing to do with theme. And so essentially they've tried to reverse the meta by saying, yes, you can still take your very, very competitive cheesy army, but you will take penalties for it because we want this game to, in theory, be about themed armies from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And so that's why they've been creating the Legendary Legions. That's why there's the various army bonuses. And what they're essentially saying is, we'd prefer if the game was themed, but if you want to run that list, you can. So, getting back on topic, that's Floyd's basic background. He's not really gone into much detail. So, with quite a few of the strategy battle game profiles, they kind of either have to build on their appearance in the films and kind of take the character from that, or they're kind of looking at him with some like heroes we covered before, like Hurin and Ingold. We've covered them in the books, so you've got enough background to sort of work out what his profile is going to be like. So with someone like Floy, you've got a name and his achievements, but you don't really have a lot more. So it's interesting to see how they take that and then use it to write the profiles.
So is Mardin a named Hand of the King, or is he a GW invention?
Mardin is a completely fictitious character. There's no reference to a Mardin in the books.
And then Murin and Dra came out round about Shadow in the East, I would think about 2006, and he was... They are a pair of wandering dwarf heroes, who are in the Wanderers in the Wild section, or you can take them as part of the Iron Hills list. They based on anything at all?
No, again, they are both completely made-up characters. Although I have to say, the sculpts for Murin and Dra are definitely some of my favourites. They're very, very nice, because they've both got an absolute unique character about them. That's the one thing I like the most about those two. They're very, very unique when you put them in with the regular dwarf warriors. They stand out quite a bit. But yeah, in terms of actual presence in the books, there's no reference to kind of like a Murin and Dra. They're made up by GW.
Okie doke then. You said about named characters in a Moria list. It also says you may include Ori, Oin, and Gimli. Why Gimli? That doesn't make too much sense to me.
That is an interesting one. I think it's Gimli and Balin are cousins in the whole in the story of the Lord of the Rings. So unless this is kind of meant to be kind of like a pre-Balin's expedition force, so kind of it could be Balin and Gimli together at the Lonely Mountain, because it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that they could have gone out patrolling for orcs together. So that's entirely possible. The alternative is you do a what if scenario, and the kind of like the Fellowship gets to Moria and Balin's expedition is still alive, but it's being pestered by goblins. And so Gimli essentially says to the Fellowship, you know what, you go on, I'm going to stay with my cousin and kind of help him clear the orcs out of Moria. So that's kind of, you've got two things to explore there. But again, it's an interesting one, but they clearly have a close relationship in the story. If you consider how devastated he is by the death of his cousin Balin, but reacts less to the death of Oin, who I presume is his uncle. And so it's kind of, he's more distraught over his cousin's death than his uncle's death. So it's kind of an interesting. There's obviously some sort of there's kind of like close friendship between the two of them. So they're kind of, I think that's what it's intending to play off.
Mm-hmm. Going to the Hobbit films, the whole plot of that revolves around we have to retrieve the Arkenstone because the dwarf kingdoms need to rally around a king before we can go and fight a dragon. So the question I had written here is, why do the dwarf kingdoms demand a shiny stone before doing a suicide mission to retake Erebor, as opposed to you just everybody flood in, we're going to kill the dragon and take the gold back?
Yeah, essentially the way the Arkenstone is portrayed in the films, it's essentially that it's the king's jewel, which means if you hold it, you essentially have the right to be king. So Thorin essentially says that stone is my birthright, and if I have it, I can then command the respect of the various dwarf kingdoms. Essentially, say this is your king speaking. I hold the king's jewel, so now we can rally together and clear out our mountain. Whereas in the book, it effectively comes a what's the term they use? Like a MacGuffin, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, the quest in the book is to essentially recover the treasure, and they're kind of like, it's the Arkenstone's introduced as like the greatest gem of the dwarf's treasure hoard, and kind of Thorin values it above everything else, and so kind of Bilbo steals it, and then when Thorin basically takes over the mountain and isn't really willing to relent, he kind of reins in on his deal with the elves and the dwarves. He essentially says, "Here you are. You can use this as a bargaining chip," and that's essentially how the Arkenstone plays out in the books. But yeah, the whole concept of the Arkenstone being like the king's jewel and the rallying point for the dwarves, it's essentially created by the films.
So after retaking Erebor, do the Iron Hills and the Grey Mountains go and relocate to Erebor, or do they stay put?
I think it's believed a considerable portion of the Iron Hills dwarves do stay and help repopulate Erebor. It's entirely possible, like the surviving dwarves from the Battle of the Five Armies, essentially they take Erebor as their home, and like the dwarves, they bring their families over, but kind of like the Lonely Mountain is kind of referred to as the Dwarven stronghold. So there's no. Again, it's kind of one of those grey areas in Lord of the Rings. It's entirely possible that the Grey Mountains and the Iron Hills were still populated by dwarf holds. But it's entirely possible that once the Lonely Mountain had been reclaimed, the majority of the dwarves moved there to to re-establish the kingdom.
So when you got the war in the north, where the dwarves have a final stand at Erebor against the Easterling invasion, is that sort of all of the dwarves from all of the different factions saying, right, this is going to be our last fight, we're all going to go together?
There is a possibility it's that, but again, it's kind of one of those that it's still a grey area. As far as we know, it's the dwarves of Erebor and the men of Dale, and probably Lake Town as well, because I'd assume they'd have laid siege to Lake Town before they marched on the Lonely Mountain. But there's no reference to dwarves from the Iron Hills or the Grey Mountains rallying to defend the mountain from the Easterling invasion. But again, it's kind of the trouble is with there's so many grey areas in the Lord of the Rings, and I think even if Tolkien had finished writing the story, there would still be grey areas. But there's absolutely nothing to suggest that a defensive force defending the mountain would have consisted of Iron Hills dwarves and Erebor dwarves as well. So
that would be an excellent thing to explore for SBG.
Exactly.
To have that as a source book, the war in the north, get Galadriel to tear down Dol Guldur. You could get Old Dane, that wonderful old model that is very hard to get hold of nowadays. Try and repurpose that somehow. And then you'd have King Brand, an updated Lake Town, whatever they evolve into. Potentially you could have new troops from the different dwarf factions. So get on that, exactly. Jay. Now, you spoke about why the dwarves and the elves came to hate each other. I was curious, is Legolas and Gimli the first friendship between the races, sort of in the modern, inverted commas, era of Middle-earth? Because actually I was looking at The Hobbit and thinking this Tauriel and Killy storyline, is there any basis for that where there's like a forbidden love story in Tolkien's writings?
Quite simply, no. The only real stories that kind of deal with not technically forbidden love, but the kind of stories that deal with it are usually between elves and men. So it's usually a female elf falls in love with a male human. It never actually goes the other way. It's never like a male elf falls in love with a female human. So, although that's an interesting story to cover, but the whole, obviously, Tauriel is, sorry, Damien, completely fictitious. She doesn't exist in the story. And so, again, the trouble is, because there are so few female characters in The Hobbit, and indeed The Lord of the Rings, you need to, in a modern era, you need to make sure you're marketing your movie correctly. And so they added the character of Tauriel, who was, again, very, very well played by Evangeline Lilly, who it turns out was a massive Tolkien fan as well. But the whole that dwarf elf love story is completely fictitious, and so kind of the whole Legolas and Gimli friendship is it's the first kind of real time that elves and dwarves are seen cooperating. So it starts in the beginning where there is genuine animosity between Legolas and Gimli. I mean, that the Council of Elrond, Gimli's like, I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf, never trust an elf, that sort of thing. And then it kind of moves on to the sort of the gentle sniping. So dwarves are invisible when closed. Yes, Gimli, their own masters cannot find them if their secrets are forgotten. And Legolas just goes with why doesn't that surprise me? So the sarcastic, little dig in the ribs there. But then kind of by the time they get to Moria and where Legolas and Gimli are falling alongside each other, there's a little bit of respect, because Legolas is the one who who vouches for Gimli to the elves of Lothlorien, who are not overly trustful of dwarves. Although again, it's still a little bit of distrust, and it's kind of like it's established when Gimli gets his gift from Galadriel, which is her 3 golden hairs, and kind of like Legolas being an elf, he kind of like he knows the story behind that. So essentially, what it was, Fëanor, who forges the Silmarils, was quite enamored of Galadriel, and essentially he asked as well if he could have a strand of her hair, and she refused him. And so it's kind of like with Gimli wanting to keep the piece of the hair and like treasure it and kind of like use it as a symbol of friendship. That's kind of where Legolas first warms to Gimli, and he kind of realizes that dwarves aren't all like greedy and obsessed with gold and jewels, and kind of like Gimli kind of just wants to use it as a token of remembrance. And kind of like Gimli, essentially, as he goes on in the story, he's very defensive of Galadriel. It's like when Éomer calls her a sorceress, and he's kind of like, you speak evil of what is beyond the reach of your thoughts. So he's quite defensive of her, and that kind of impresses Legolas as well. And kind of like by the time it's reached the Battle of Helm's Deep, where they have their little contest, which I genuinely have no clue how Gimli managed to win that. Because if you think how far Legolas was ahead in the films, if in the films he's like 19-2 ahead, and somehow manages to lose by a single orc, despite killing all those Uruk-hai on the ladder as well. So
yeah, there's no way that tally is accurate, to be honest.
No, I don't. I honestly don't know how Legolas managed to lose that one. But essentially, yeah, Gimli is the overall winner. And then by the time of the Return of the King, they're firm friends, and that kind of carries on into the Fourth Age. And then right at the end of the story, after the death of Aragorn, Legolas builds a ship in Ithilien, and then he sails across the sea and takes Gimli with him. And so Gimli is the only dwarf to visit the Undying Lands in the very far west. So it's kind of, that shows you just how far their friendship evolved, to the very point that Legolas went across the sea and he took his friend with him. So that kind of just shows you how, from initially just complete dislike of each other, they eventually get on so well that they literally go west together.
Legolas smuggling his pet dwarf through customs.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's like there's like joke fan arc of Gimli Legolas just carrying in Gimli just to Thranduil and says, "Father, can I keep him?" And Legolas and Thranduil just rolling his eyes, that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm sure I've seen something like that. But yeah, it's a very, very good story of friendship, and that's kind of the friendship is a key part of Tolkien's writings. So it's kind of like how their friendship overcomes like the differences between their races, which is, again, it's a very, very good story. So
I thought it was okay that Legolas was brought into the Hobbit, but I thought they could have done more of a character arc with him, because initially at Fellowship he's distrusting of dwarves. So maybe you could introduce something in the films that causes him to be so, and you've actually got a perfect setup where Killy essentially nicks his girlfriend. But in order for that to be an arc, Legolas would have had to have started off being ambivalent or neutral towards dwarves at best, whereas he's pretty much nasty to them from the first thing he says. "I will kill you, dwarf." And then it's quite interesting where you've got Fellowship, where he is obviously still doing these sort of snipey comments, and the closest thing they get to sort of rescuing each other is Gimli slips on the stairs and Legolas catches him by the beard. And then at the start of the Two Towers, one of the first encounters they have is with the Riders of Rohan, and Éomer makes a threat towards Gimli, and Legolas immediately puts an arrow in his face, saying, "I will rescue him before your stroke falls." So I thought that was sort of accelerated. Did they miss a bit from the books where their relationship develops?
Yeah, because this is kind of... it makes more sense if you watch the extended editions, because in the extended edition of Fellowship of the Ring, there's that whole scene of them leaving Lothlorien, and it's kind of like they're leaving Lothlorien. Gimli does it. She gave me 3 hairs, and it's kind of like Legolas has this little knowing smirk on his face, and like if you're a Tolkien purist who's kind of like read the Silmarillion and knows the background, you kind of like Legolas has kind of realised, oh right, so she gave him some hairs, and yet didn't give it to one of the greatest elves who ever lived. So there was obviously something about this dwarf. So it shows how like they do warm to each other as it goes on. So. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's kind of So that's kind of one of the best. I think a lot of people these days, when they sit down and watch the film, they always go for the extended edition. And the extended editions are better because they just cover the lore a lot more as well. Like in the extended edition of The Two Towers, there's that whole scene where you find out that Aragorn is actually 87 years old. He's one of the Dunedain, they're blessed with long life, and how he's like the Dunedain are dying out. But you kind of understand like Aragorn's backstory as well. So that's kind of, it's just like little extra details like that kind of just like adds to the overall story. So.
Well, when I tried to introduce an X to the films, I actually thought I'll go for the theatrical because they're paced a bit better. Like if you might have a tendency to find fantasy boring, the extended versions with all the extra information possibly isn't needed yet.
I think
the only time. Yeah.
If you're introducing someone to The Lord of the Rings the first time, go with the theatrical editions, and then if they like it, let them know there is an extended edition, by the way. Really, and that's kind of So once you've got their interest, then you can kind of then go for the extended editions. But I think if you're introducing someone to The Lord of the Rings at first, the best way to do it is through the theatrical versions, and then maybe the extended editions. And then if they really want to go full depth into the lore, then you can introduce them to the books, because the books are absolutely brilliant. But having spoken to people who kind of said I like the films but I didn't like the books, they kind of go, I kind of understand that, because the books are very, very wordy. Obviously, Tolkien was a professor of English, so he knew how to use like the languages and the prose and stuff like that. So kind of they are very wordy, but they're definitely worth reading. So.
And one day you find the girlfriend hunched over in a cave with a copy of the Silmarillion, muttering, "My precious."
Exactly. Yeah. Once they start reading the Silmarillion, you know you've got them hooked because they just want more and more. So.
Well, the last question I've got written down to ask you on my interrogation checklist is: how heavy is a dwarf? I.e., how hench is Aragorn with his tossing abilities? I doubt that's something Tolkien would have gone. The average weight of a dwarf is 300 pounds. But
possibly. I mean, dwarves are quite. They're small, but I would assume dwarves are quite heavy because they carry around all that armor and weaponry. So, you have to say that a dwarf would probably be the weight of your average man, considering he's weighed down with all the heavy armor. Then if he has a shield as well, then his axe. But that is still an impressive feat of throwing dwarves. But again, it has to be the right dwarf, because whilst Aragorn was quite capable of throwing Gimli, he would probably have struggled with Bomber. So
yes, everyone would have struggled with Bomber.
By the time of Lord of the Rings, Bomber's got so fat he needs 6 dwarves to carry him. So
I was going to say, isn't there a bit in the Hobbit book where he falls in the river and it knocks him asleep with magic, and then they have to carry him, and it's like 4 of the company have to.
He's blooming heavy, so yeah.
And yet he can outsprint everyone in Thorin's company when being chased by a bear. So it's remarkable what you can do with the right motivation.
Oh yes, but as Glenn says, dwarves are very dangerous dwarves are natural sprinters. So very dangerous over short distances.
Well, for the films, they didn't know. Like the director just said to the actor for Bomber, literally just peg it as fast as you can. And all the confused reactions from his cast members are genuine because they had no idea he could go that quick in that fat suit.
Yes, it is quite a good scene, yeah.
So you have some Q&A from the listeners because you put out a post because you're organised asking for questions on dwarf lore. So I'll let you take us away for that.
Sam Huddy asks for a quick outline of the war between orcs and dwarves that culminated in Azog being slain by Dane. Who was involved, who was killed, and how, any characters we already knew besides the obvious Thror, Thrain and Thorin. And there's reference to someone called Frerin, so Rerin? Could he be a potential future profile? And to answer the Frerin question, I think he's Thorin's brother. I could be wrong, but yeah, I think
that sounds like a Tolkien joke, doesn't it? Because frère is brother in French, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Tolkien is, like I said, he's very, very good at languages. You have dwarves who are called a nain, so Nain, and nain is French for dwarf.
He's dwarf.
So the name literally means the names are literally dwarf the dwarf. So
yeah.
But yeah, if you literally look at the literally the hobbits, so this is Oin, this is Gloin, this is Befor, Bofor, Bombor, Dori, Nori, Ori, that sort of thing. So yeah, he wasn't. They're still unique names, but so yeah, to give you a backstory of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and this is the actual story. So this is the official Tolkien story, because the one that's obviously covered in the Hobbit trilogy is completely different. So that's created from the films, obviously, I think, just to give the trilogy its antagonist. So in the trilogy, in the original Battle of Dimril Dale, Thorin cuts off Azog's arm, and so the rest of the Hobbit trilogy, Azog is hunting down Thorin to kill him and essentially the line of Durin. So that's that story. And then...
So it essentially turns into Captain Hook. I'm going to revenge the guy that cut off my hand. I'm going to hunt my crocodile.
Yeah. So yeah, but then getting into the actual War of the Dwarves and Orcs. So to give you the background, at this point, Smaug has attacked the Lonely Mountain, and the dwarves have been driven out. So they become a wandering people. So they're wandering around. I think it's Dunland at this point, and Thror gets it into his head to venture into the mines of Moria. So what he essentially does, he takes the key to the secret door and the map and the dwarf ring, passes it on to Thrain, and goes off with a lonely dwarf to the east gate of Moria. So that's where the pool is. And obviously there's no mention of the Watcher at this point in the story, because he doesn't appear until later on. So essentially what happens is Thror enters through the gates of Moria and leaves his companion waiting on the doorstep, essentially. And then after a while, nothing happens. And then a few days later, Thror's headless body is thrown out of the gates. And so his companion rushes to the gates, and he's warned there by Azog that this will be the fate of any dwarf that dares venture into Moria. So the head's then thrown out as well, and the beard's has been shaved. Thror's beard has been shaved off, and the name Azog has been branded into his forehead. So what essentially happens is the dwarf runs off with the head, and then a little pouch of money is thrown out as well. And then what essentially happens is Thror's body is desecrated and thrown to the crows. And then essentially what happens is this dwarf returns to Thrain, who in a rage tears his beard and says, "This will not stand." And so what then happens is a very long and bloody war that takes place under the ground between the dwarves and the orcs. So essentially from the Iron Hills to the Grey Mountains, the dwarves as well, I think, lay siege to Mount Gundabad and drive the orcs away from that. And essentially what happens is nearly all the orcs are driven back to Moria. And so that culminates in the great big battle of Dimril Dale. And so kind of like the dwarves that do take place in it, we know that Thrain and Thorin are there. We know that I think Balin and Dwalin might have been there, because their father is there as well. That's Fundin. And Fundin is slain in the Battle of Dimril Dale, and so is Frerin. So, yeah, Thorin loses his brother at the Battle of Dimril Dale. But it is also,
if you wanted to, you could potentially have Frerin and Fundin as profiles for an army of Thror.
You could do, yeah. But yeah, so essentially what happens is the various dwarves, like the Erebor survivors, they arrive. They're fighting first, and kind of they're getting driven back by the sheer weight of numbers. They're driven into the woods, and during the battle, Thorin's shield is basically rent asunder by the orcs. So what he then does is cut a branch from an oak tree with his axe, and then starts using that as a shield/club. So hence Thorin earns the name Oakenshield. So the film got that fairly true to the story, and then what then happens is the dwarves of the Iron Hills arrive, and they add like fresh legs to the battle, and they kind of add fresh numbers, and they kind of like drive the dwarves back to the very gates. They drive the orcs, I should say, back to the very gates of Moria. And at this point, Nain, who is the Lord of the Iron Hills at that point, they drive the orcs back to the very steps of Moria, and Azog makes his appearance. He's described as like this hulking orc clad in like black mail with a spear and that sort of thing. So
ironic, therefore, that Azog appears at the battle in the film basically topless, which always struck me as a weird decision for a battle. But
yeah, it's a strange one. But then again, I do like the design of Azog in The Hobbit. He's a very good-looking villain. It's the same with Bold as well. He looks they're both convincing villains. They look very, very good. And the fact that they've got the like the pale white skin, if you compare that to like the greyish dark skin of the orcs, they really do stand out. So that kind of as villains go, they are quite good. But then getting back to the main battle, Azog fights against Nain, and because Nain's been fighting for the whole battle, he's exhausted, whereas Azog is a lot fresher. He's not been doing anything, so essentially Nain takes a huge big swing with his axe. Azog dodges, and as he does, he strikes a blow on Nain's neck, which, although it's deflected by the armor, it breaks the dwarf's neck, so that kills him. So Azog thinks he's killed the dwarf leader, but then he looks around and realizes that things have gone sour, and his orcs are either being slain and or being driven off. So he kind of hot-foots it back to Moria, and at this point, a young dwarf leaps after him with a bright red axe, and this is Dane Ironfoot. And so essentially, what happens is Dane catches with him before the gates of Erebor and kills him pretty much in the gateway of Moria. And so that's the end of Azog the Defiler. And so his head is cut off. It's mounted on a stick, and they stick the pouch that he threw out after the decapitating Thrall. They stuff that into his, and they consider that debt repaid. But obviously, at that point, the battle's over. But the dwarves don't venture into Moria because Dane has literally stood in the doorway, and he can feel the presence of the Balrog. And so they kind of like Thrain and all that lot are more than happy to push into Moria, and he simply says, "No, the Balrog is still alive, and it's not. We can't go back until it's gone." So, and kind of like
do Balrogs have an expiry date? Are they not immortal?
I think they are considered immortal. Yeah, because again, they're Maiar, they're spirits, so they can be slain, but they don't. We don't actually know the age of the Balrog in the Fellowship of the Ring. It could be that it could be several thousand. It could be thousands and thousands of years old. So, but so that's the end of the battle there, and the dwarves essentially they burn their dead, and apparently every dwarf went away from the battle carrying a massive load of weaponry and armor that they're obviously taken from their fallen kin, and so kind of they burned their dead because they didn't have enough stone to bury them all, because it was quite a the battle whilst they wiped out the orcs, it took a very heavy toll on the dwarves as well. But it's kind of then by the time you get to the Battle of the Five Armies, you have Bolg, who is Azog's son, and it's kind of like Dane knows Bolg because he slew Azog before the gates of Moria, and so it would have been an interesting story to cover that, but I think they the way Peter Jackson does it introduces like the main antagonist of the trilogy, and it elevates Thorin's status, because it's kind of like the way Balin tells the story. It's like the dwarves are lost and leaderless, and kind of like Thorin then rallies the dwarves by making his stand against Azog, and so it kind of it elevates Thorin to the king of the dwarves, and I do have to say though, Thorin was very, very well played by Richard Armitage, because he kind of had the charisma to pull off the role of Thorin. So you kind of introduce Thorin as he's a very, like, the way Tolkien describes him, like Thorin is like he's a very important dwarf, and yeah, I think Richard Armitage played that part quite well. And to be perfectly honest, the way the casting of the dwarves in the Hobbit film was very, very good. Kind of each one, they all got their own little bit of character as well. So you kind of see, obviously Thorin is the leader. You got Balin is the old wise dwarf. Dwalin is the warrior. Fili and Kili are the young, sort of like the young rascals.
The pretty ones.
Bombor is the greedy one. You got Nori is the little, he's the one who's stealing everything. But then you got Oin, who is kind of like he's the healer, a little bit of lawmaster. Glóin again, he is a bit of a fighter, but he's more like he's the sullen, grumpy one. Especially the way he kind of goes, "Oh, I have been bled dry by this whole mission," that sort of thing. And then you got Ori, he's kind of like the young one, but he's kind of like he's trying to prove himself. And then Bofur is kind of like he's the one in every group of friends who's always trying to kind of keep the spirits up, especially the way he kind of, and as well, he was played very, very well by James Nesbitt, who was a very, very good actor. And kind of like you got the whole Bombor's the one who kind of like tries to he's trying to keep the like a little bit of he's keeping the morale up in the group. So yeah, they're all played quite well.
Which is the one with the starfish hair?
That's Nori, I think.
There's a bit at the, I don't know, I thought it was potentially a slightly awkward scene at the end of Battle of the Five Armies where they said, "Oh, you can tell him yourself." And Bilbo turns around to look at the dwarves, and
there they all are. Yeah.
The music, the music then swells as you're meant to reflect on the journey that they've been through and the bonds of friendship that they've made. But I'm looking at this lineup of 8 dwarves going, Lumpy, the funny one, and I thought it was potentially a slightly misplaced scene there at the end. Well, it was quite emotional. So, what's the next question?
It's a little bit strange. Again, The Hobbit. I think the general consensus of the Hobbit trilogy is not as good as the Lord of the Rings. I think one of the biggest problem is Jackson didn't really have the time he spent on Lord of the Rings to do the Hobbit. He was essentially he was kind of like he was brought in and then told to just get it out as quickly as possible. So I think if he'd been given a bit more time to just like do what he did with Lord of the Rings that he did with The Hobbit, then we would have got a better trilogy. It's still a good trilogy. They're still very, very well made films. And then, but yeah, the counter argument is it went a little overboard with the CGI, and then you've got the sort of like the stretched out plot, and then kind of like the massive divergence away from the actual story. But they're still good films in their own right. But yeah, you can't compare with Lord of the Rings. And I don't really think you should compare the two trilogies, because The Hobbit is a very, very different story from the Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit is kind of like this sort of like adventure that's full of perils, but the Lord of the Rings is far darker and far sinister. There's a lot more at stake in the Lord of the Rings than there is in the Hobbit. So kind of like they are two different stories, but yeah, I think that's why you need to treat them separately.
I was shying away from the direct comparison, but if you take the scene I was describing and put it up against the end of Return of the King, where Frodo awakens in the bed and the Fellowship come in one by one, and you think, with all the memories of what's happened in the last 10 hours of screen time. There's Gimli, there's Legolas, who ironically has not exchanged a word with Frodo, but will escape past that. And then you compare that to the end of Battle of the Five Armies, and I'm looking at them going, I can't even remember the names of half the dwarves stood in the doorway. I think Honest Trailers refers to Battle of the Five Armies as
Yeah.
the bloating of the 5 pages, which I thought
Yeah,
was fairly appropriate.
It's a little different because again, with Lord of the Rings, you've got a lot fewer characters to focus on. You've got the 9 members of the Fellowship, but they all go off and they all have independent stories. Whereas the Hobbit is one single story that effectively focuses on all of them. So it's because obviously you've got to focus on Bilbo, but then also you've got the focus on Thorin as well. So it's difficult when you've got 13 characters in a single scene to sort of like give all of them the appropriate screen time to establish themselves. Whereas in something like The Lord of the Rings, where you've got scenes where it's Frodo and Sam on their own, it's Merry and Pippin on their own, it's the 3 Hunters on their own, it's a lot easier for them to kind of to convey their character across. So again, it's kind of I think it is again, you just need to treat them as separate film series, really.
Rightio. What's the next question?
The next question was yours on Murindra, Floy, Marvin, and any basis of them in the written lore. And yeah, we covered that one briefly, but the only named character out of that lot that appears in the books is Floy. But again, there's not really a lot that that we're told about him. Again, he's a dwarf that is part of Balin's expedition. He's kind of one of the effectively, I think he is one of the first casualties in the whole expedition. So he kind of, we know he takes part in the fight outside the gates of Moria. We know he slays, we assume a great orc chieftain, that sort of thing, and then he's slain by an arrow and he's laid to rest in the outside the gates of Moria. So, but yeah, the others, Mardin is fictitious. Muir and Drar are fictitious as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of it for those named dwarf profiles. And then if you look at the Iron Hills profiles, again, the thing even with the regular dwarven profiles, things like the Khazad Guard, the Iron Guard, the Rangers, they don't really get they don't get much mention. So again, they've been purely created by the game as well. So I think it was just to expand the various dwarven units. When we got the Khazad source book, before then, all you really had were you had the dwarf kings, which are very nice models. You had Balin and his Khazad Guard, and then you had the old metal dwarf warriors. So I think when they expanded the range and did the Khazad source book, they needed to broaden out the army. If you're going to feel a fully fledged dwarf army, and so we got the Vault Wardens, we got the Rangers, we got the Iron Guard as well, which are all really, really nice models. And the sort of the fun thing is they've kind of got a big prominence if you're taking a Durin's Folk army list. So you'll nearly always have Vault Wardens. You probably have a few Iron Guard because they're fight 4 with 2 attacks. So why wouldn't you? So yeah, you've got the Dwarf Rangers as well, which I think they have quite a nice aesthetic as well. So kind of like you can have your Lord of your Dwarf Stronghold, then you can have his bodyguard, you can have the regular rank and file warriors, you can have some specialist troops as well that kind of help defend in fighting in the tunnels, and then you've got the Rangers who effectively can protect the stronghold and the surrounding area. So there's kind of they really have expanded the dwarf range, which is really nice, and the models are quite nice as well. But what's nice as well is I had some of the existing metal dwarves, which were very, very nice models, but they blended in really, really well with the new range of plastics that came out. So it's kind of like if you put one in the midst of a load of plastics, they would be a little bit harder to spot until you look closely, because you kind of realize, oh, hang on, that one's posed slightly differently to the others. But when you're actually looking at them on the tabletop, it was hard to tell what was plastic and what was metal. So that was nice. And then obviously the new Iron Hills range with Forge World, the models are absolutely beautiful. So much detail on even just like the regular rank and file dwarf warriors. You cannot fault the detail on those sculpts. They are sensational. And obviously Iron Hills are a very, very popular army list. I think if you go to a GBHL event these days, there is nearly always an Iron Hills army, and you've got the chariots, you've got the ballista, and Dane himself is a very, very nice model, and he plays really, really well. But again, he's kind of that's another example where the casting was really good, because Billy Connolly playing Dane was actually really, really good. So,
well, let me touch on Dane just a second there, because you said about a red axe at the earlier battle, but in the film he has a giant red hammer. So maybe the colour is an influence. I was wondering, should he have had an axe?
I think the colour is an influence. I think as well, it makes the dwarves a bit more unique, because you think every single one of them in the film, all the dwarves of Thorin's company have all got their own weapons. So it kind of, I think, adds a little bit of just a little bit of uniqueness to the character. And I like that. Yes, they gave Dane a hammer, but it's still painted red, so they've got that nice little tie-in with the lore as well. So that's kind of it's very, very well done. I mean, yes, if they were being true to the books, Dane should have had an axe, but then on the flip side, the dwarves should have had their own weapons as well, because it kind of says that the dwarves they're not really armed that much. They kind of like got little knives and things. They don't really do. They do more fighting in the films than they do in the books. It's only when they get to in the books. It's only when they get to like Erebor and they get their hands on the armor and the weapons. That's when they are really fighting. So they kind of the films they added more fight scenes, so it made sense for the dwarves to have their own unique weapons. So like Thorin's got his short sword. Dwalin's got his big hammer, and he's got the two axes. Ori's got his slingshot. Keely's got his bow. Feely's got his twin swords. So all the dwarves have their own unique weapons, which again kind of ties the characters together quite nicely. So it's kind of it adds individualism to the character, because otherwise it's just a dwarf with an axe. I think as well because you've got Gimli with his axe, they kind of wanted to make Gimli like the only axe wielding dwarf in the series. So.
Is there any basis whatsoever in lore for riding goats and pigs? Because actually, goat cavalry for dwarves, once you saw it, you just thought, oh, of course, that's the most natural mounted thing in the world that a dwarf would ride into battle, that you'd find on a mountainside. But it exists there is a game called Dwarf Wars, I believe, a miniature game, and they have goat riding dwarves in that. Is it something in Warhammer Fantasy?
Not really. I think the Iron Hills army is the only mounted dwarf option that I've seen in tabletop gaming. And again, you can
get ponies in Thorin's company, but it's
you
not
can get you do get ponies in Thorin's company, and that's kind of like the only example of mounted dwarves is when they're riding ponies at the start of the book, as they make their initial journey to Rivendell and all that sort of thing. But in terms of mounted dwarves, it's only the ponies. I don't think there's any references to dwarves riding into battle they don't really ride into battle. They're on their feet the whole time. So
that only really makes sense if you see the extended edition where Dane actually sends in a cavalry charge because in the theatrical version you just get magically appearing goats for Thorin and his company.
All of a sudden the goat appears and where did that come from? But again, it's kind of the same thing with the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. If you watch the extended editions of the trilogies, you kind of get a lot more story, which makes sense.
The difference I would say is the Lord of the Rings extended editions, all of the extended scenes are cuttable, like they're extended material. But the Hobbit seemed to actually leave out some scenes which were sort of needed for storytelling purposes. So in the theatrical version of Battle of the Five Armies, the Arkenstone disappears into Bard's pocket and is never seen again. Whereas in the extended version, you actually see it's put to rest with Thorin. It's in the mountain where Dane takes over as king. That was a shame, but as you say, the whole production was fairly rushed. So,
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to go back to because you said Floy was the first dwarf to die in the retaking of Moria, but I had read somewhere that somebody from Thorin's company gets eaten by the Watcher when they try to get in the first instance.
Actually, no. Oin is eaten by the Watcher in the water, but that happens later on in the story. So, what essentially happens is the dwarves do arrive at Moria and then kind of begin the process of driving out the orcs from the halls, and they effectively do drive them out from the upper levels, and like Balin puts his seat up in the chamber of Mazarbul, and they enjoy a little bit of prosperity, but then things go south very quickly because Balin is slain, and then all of a sudden there's a load more orcs have arrived, and the dwarves get forced further and further back. And I think what effectively happens is Oin is sent towards the west gate of Moria, and then what effectively happens is I think they're trying to find a way out, but they get there and the pool is already up to the wall, and so I think what must have happened is Oin rushes out the gates and the Watcher must reach out and grab him, and kind of like the dwarves realise, oh, hang on, there's no way we're getting out that way, and it leads to the dwarves being effectively trapped in the mines of Moria, and they're eventually overwhelmed by all the goblins. So whilst Oin is killed by the Watcher in the water, he's not the first casualty in the whole reclaiming. So
if they knew the Balrog was still in there, why did Balin go with an expedition force? Because it's only 60 years later, less than that.
Yeah, in terms of timescale between the Battle of Dimril Dale and the Hobbit, we know that some considerable time has passed, and then obviously you've got the whole 60 years after the end of the Hobbit. You have the events of Lord of the Rings, and there's kind of like a 17-year gap between Bilbo going off and Frodo setting off. So sort of like 30 years prior to that, so you're looking at about 50 years after the events of the Battle of the Five Armies. So the way they explain it in the books is Balin essentially has been listening too long to the whispers that of Moria, because kind of like obviously at this point the Balrog's not been seen for ages since that. It could have been many decades since the Battle of Dimril Dale, but I think the story is Dane does grant him leave to go, but he's very, very reluctant. So kind of like I think Dane knows the risks, but I think because Balin is so insistent, he eventually lets him go. So I think he must have been worried, but he essentially says he couldn't persuade him otherwise. So it's kind of, I think that's the reasoning there.
So I think it was this week, actually, we got the announcement of the quest of the Ringbearer Sourcebook edition. I say this week because with life as it currently is, days fade into decades, legend becomes myth. And what aspects can they cover? Because this is one where they had, I can't remember, I think it was called Shadow and Flame, the original Sourcebook. And that's like 2002. And then about 2008, they do Khazad-dûm. So this would be the third time they've covered the dwarves in Moria. I was just wondering what profiles there are left that could be made, or what stories have not been told yet.
In theory, because if Quest for the Ringbearer covers like the various journeys of Moria, you could have a little sort of sub campaign where you have Balin's expedition, but the kind of like the references to characters, you could possibly get new sculpts for Ori, Owen, and potentially Balin to sort of represent them in their Moria gear. And then there's references to a few dwarves as well. So like when they kind of like list dwarves that are killed as the orcs basically start to retake Moria. You've got references to dwarves called Fra, Loni, and Nali. So these could potentially be dwarf captains, or they could be like lieutenants in Balin's expedition. But yeah, in terms of covering the lore, the only ones that are likely are the probably probably like the Balin's colony. So they might just do a little like when they first take Moria, and then kind of like the little campaigns as the dwarves are slowly driven back to the to Balin's tomb, where they make their last stand. So there's potential for scenarios like that, but I think because this book is going to be focusing on Frodo's quest, it might just be like a little acknowledgement. So they might do a single scenario where they depict the dwarves' last stand. So it's entirely possible, but I think that there's going to be more focus on Frodo's quest rather than on the dwarves themselves. So, but yeah, we might get a little bit of knowledge, and it's entirely possible Balin's expedition might be turned into a legendary legion. We don't know. So the best thing we can do is speculate like mad, and
oh yes, speculate wildly, everybody.
And then wait and see what comes. I mean, we were if you throw back to our very first lore podcast where we looked at Gondor at War, we discussed the possibility of Angbor and Mablung being turned into profiles, and we were right on that one. So Woo-hoo. You never know. We might be making very bold predictions here, but you never know if they start coming true.
You just to check you, there's not Angbor is the broadsword guy from the fiefdoms, isn't he? This one's like Andorn or something.
Oh yeah, Angbor. Yeah. So you've got Mablung, who I think is the one with the bow and the sword, and then you've got Anborn, which is the one that's just holding the bow. And kind of like, Mablung is one of I think one of Faramir's lieutenants, and then Anborn is one of the sentries who spots Gollum jumping into the forbidden pool. So yeah, they are minor heroes, but they're nice little additions to like the Rangers of Ithilien list. But yeah, in terms of what else is coming, we can only speculate. But yeah, I'm very excited by that source book. So it's gonna be interesting to see, because this is kind of like, it's an interesting source book because originally you had going way back, at least probably at least 15 years ago, you had the Journey books where they kind of you could do
book 2005. Yep.
Yeah, so where you could do the whole story of the Fellowship of the Ring, you could do the whole story of the Two Towers, and you could do the whole story of the Return of the King. So what's entirely possible for like the scenarios is they've taken all of the Fellowship scenarios that appear in those three books. So for example, the Fellowship, you've got the Shortcut to Mushrooms scenario where they're trying to escape from the Black Rider. The Buckleby Ferry scenario, which is quite a good one, where you had 4 hobbits trying to outrun Ringwraiths on horseback. That was never an easy one to play, but then you didn't have all the heroic actions you do now. So it'll be very interesting to see. What might be fun is just from a pure hobby perspective, if you've still got those original Journey books, try recreating those scenarios using the new rules and see if they come out any differently now that certain heroes have access to heroic march, certain heroes can perform heroic actions that others can't. So that sort of thing. So it's very interesting. You could potentially take on the Balrog, and you can do heroic strikes, which the Balrog can't do. And then back then, you kind of you had to rely on your opponent rolling badly for his monsters and his heroes, because now obviously you can just call a heroic strike, and then your hero can go toe to toe with a monster. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they take any of those old scenarios and apply it into the new book.
I did do when I first got back in like March 2017. I was building lots of terrain from the Journey books, and so I did do one of my favourites was the one where they're running down the staircase. You got goblins coming in at either end, and bits of the walkway break away, and then so I did that with Callum Royal, and then we did the Balin's tomb that goes before that, and then the chase to the Bridge of Khazad-dûm afterwards. And we say, right, we'll do it with modern heroic. I mean, at that point, it was still the Hobbit edition, but
Yeah.
Even so, the fact that Aragorn can do 3 heroic march every turn just means, because the big drawback traditionally is that you've got 4 vulnerable hobbits that can only go 4 inches a turn, whereas now they just meet. They were over the bridge before the goblins got anywhere near them. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, and if you wanted to, I mean, in theory, you got the potential to recreate an enormous board there, where you could do the like the first scenario in that. I think you got the first scenario with the Watcher in the water. Then you've got Balin's Tomb. Then you've got the escape through Dwaradelf, and then you've got the Bridge of Khazad-dûm scenario. So you could effectively have one massive long 8 by 10 board or something like that, and have the Watcher in the water at one end, have the Bridge of Khazad-dûm at the other end, and then kind of see if you can get all your members of the Fellowship from one end of the board to the other. That'd be quite a fun day of gaming.
There is a linked board. This is going way back. This is a very old White Dwarf. I got the best of White Dwarf, the Fellowship edition. It's got the Balrog and a miniature Gandalf on it. And it did show the people in the team 20 years ago building these connected boards. They had a whole Moria setup. It's really good to have a look at if you can get hold of that secondhand on eBay somewhere.
Yeah, well, we've got there is a new Best of White Dwarf coming in the upcoming month, so it's entirely possible that might feature in there. So yeah, but if you can get your hands on an old copy, that's definitely worth doing. But looking forward to the quest to the Fellowship scenario sourcebook. I'll be very interested to see what the scenarios are and how they're going to kind of link it in a single campaign. Because in theory, if Frodo gets killed in one of the scenarios, it's going to be a bit awkward to continue the campaign. So,
well, what they did in the old campaign linking was then you gave the ring to someone else, but they had a penalty which was something like take a courage test every turn, and if they fled, then you'd add it.
Yeah, you had to do a courage test, otherwise they ran away with the ring because they didn't have the Baggins strength. But then, of course, the other thing they're introducing in the books is the Fantasy Fellowship, which I'm really looking forward to.
Because I remember doing that when the old White Dwarf was out, and this struggle you always had was basically getting the balance of the points, because Merry and Pippin at 10 points each allowed you to have Gandalf and Aragorn and Boromir and whoever. So basically, if you wanted an all-roundy fighty fellowship, you basically wound up with 8 characters that were all sort of a captain of men or up to maybe Faramir standards. You didn't really have any big hitters.
No, you didn't. That's true. So it's going to be interesting to see what they what people come up with. And there's as soon as the book comes out, there's going to be a plethora of posts in the GBHL Facebook pages just to here's my Fantasy Fellowship, and we might well get a GBHL event where everyone's Fantasy Fellowship takes on each other. So that'd be interesting to see.
I want a Fantasy Fellowship for the evil side.
That
Gollum as the ring bearer, and then
that'd be very interesting to see how that plays out. So it's essentially you swap each member of the Fellowship with their sort of like their evil equivalent. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge for players, trying to work out which member who's the evil equivalent of each member of the Fellowship. So
you'd have the best of boy bands. You have Dalamir and Suladan and Amda and Lurtz and
exactly.
Gothmog. You have a spellcaster. Here's the Witch King. At that point, why is there a ring bearer at all? The Witch King just stabs Gollum and takes it. But whatever, we're running with it. We got wildly off topic here, but
as you always do when you're having discussions. But that's been the Dwarven lore, and then a little bit of a look to the future. So,
are there any further Q&As from Facebook?
No, we've covered all of those questions.
Then one final question for you: one Dwarven profile that has not got an SBG profile that you would like to see.
Oh, that's a tricky one. Probably a cliche, but I'd like them to just bring back like the old Dane profile. Mm-hmm. So like where you had he had his essentially, yeah, because what was really good, they had like the venerable special rule, which essentially like to represent his age, he had to re-roll jump tests and re-roll climb tests as well. So it's sort of like just little things like that. So just he's kind of like he's old and he's not as young as he once was. But again, the old Dane model was really really nice as well. It had a lot of character to it, but because yeah, they might do a war in an all source book where we get like the Eastlings versus the dwarves. So yeah, but it'd be interesting to see. But yeah, if they did bring back if they introduce a new dwarf profile, it would be either the old version of Dane, or maybe look at some like potential for like new dwarves in Barlin's company, that sort of thing.
Yeah, because for me, not necessarily from a profile standpoint, but I liked your idea of having fresh sculpts where they're basically trying to have as they're portrayed in the Hobbit film, and then you try and add Moria armor to them. So that could be a nice challenge for the sculptors, see what they come up with.
Yeah, sort of like how did they look 50 odd years later? So yeah, because Balin thinks he's old at the time of the Hobbit series, so it'll be interesting to see what it looked like in the Moria get-up.
And if you want more tactics on how to get the most out of a Khazad-dûm or indeed any other dwarf list, then for a shameless self-plug, check out Josh interviewing Ali King, also on the East Anglia Community Podcast. Till next time, thank you very much. This has been the East Anglia Hobbit Community Lore Podcast, where James has talked us through the lore of the dwarves and their role in the SBG. What do you think we should tackle next? We've done the elves, we've done the dwarves. Should we do a source book focus, or can we do something like hobbits?
Hobbits would be interesting. Evil men, I think, would be quite a good podcast. Evil men like the Haradrim and the Eastling, because there's definitely backstory to those. So yeah, but yeah, we've got potential for future series. A source book review would be interesting because we've not done War and Rohan and looked at the profiles in that one, and that would continue the series. But yeah, I think a source book review of War and Rohan would be quite good because that fits in with what we did on Gondor at War as well. So
sure. And if any of the listeners have requests on areas of the Middle Earth lore or a source book or profile they particularly want us to talk about on these lore dives, let us know. Until next time, take care.
Cheerio.